Hello, so this is just a brief look at a social approach to studying psychology. So, the first thing you sort of think about is what is a social context, and the social context can be very, very many things. At home with your family, with your friends, maybe at college, at a music festival, at a party, in the cinema, generally within your culture, and many, many other things. When we're with other people, we are in a social context. And social psychologists believe that behaviour should be studied in the social context if we are to understand why people behave the way they do or why they show certain characteristics. So what is social psychology? Well, according to Alport, social psychology is how people think, feel, and behave with regard to others, and how their thoughts, feelings, and actions are affected by others. And so, if we are studying the way people behave in response to others, or how they change their behaviour as a result, then we are really looking at behaviour from a social psychology point of view. So, what sort of things do social psychologists study? Things like learned aggression, so how we show aggressive behaviours because we've been rewarded for them or because we've seen somebody else doing them, but they have been learnt in some way. Things like the concept of personality, what makes us who we are, and does who we are change dependent on our social context? Am I going to behave differently with one group of friends who are the same age as me than I do with my boss, than I do with my family at home? And also the influence of other people on a social influence. So why do we obey people when they tell us what to do? Why do we copy what other people do? Why do we change our behaviour? Now, during the course of the A level, we will be looking at learned aggression. We will be looking at social influence, and most particularly in more detail, social influence. And they are topics that are on the specification. So you will look at quite a lot of social psychology in your time with us. So social psychology really is looking at kind of two levels of context, if you like. The macro context, so that's the much wider context. That's sort of thinking about individuals existing in a specific culture or within society or on a more broad scale, or also on a temporal context, so where they are in history. And then we also have the micro context, so how you're influenced by your immediate social circle, so friends and family. And things that might fit into these, so for example, in the macro context, you've got cultural traditions, how you might behave within a crowd, for example. And then also within the micro context, then you've got things on a much lower level: peer pressure, interaction with family, love. So just to give you an idea of how social psychology has changed over the years, we can really look way, way back if we really wanted to, before, if you like, before the birth of psychology as a science in itself. We can look at the earlier thoughts of how humans are social beings and how they interact in a social world. So way back to Aristotle, where he suggests that humans are naturally sociable. And that's why we have society, because we want to be together, we want to be interacting with other people at all times. Skipping out quite a lot of time now and looking at the time of sort of John Locke. And John Locke suggested that humans are blank slates, tabula rasa. And we are what our experience has made of us, what have we learned from our experience, and that leads us to behave the way we are or show the characteristics that we do show, and therefore who we are and how we behave is influenced by our learning in the social world. And then we can move on to what Hegel's thoughts, society is inevitably linked with the development of a social mind. In order for us to develop our behaviours that are responsive to one another, it is linked to our society. Our society will affect that, and our behaviours will affect the society. So hopefully you will remember this guy here from your Origins of Psychology lessons. This is Wilhelm Wundt, also known as the father of psychology by many, as he started up the first psychology lab, and hopefully you remember a little bit about that. But it can be argued that social psychology in its sort of first form can be traced back to Wundt's concept of Volker psychology or folk psychology, understanding people in a group. And what he was interested in was looking at things like customs and really looking at myths as well. So how do these affect the behaviour within these groups, because they differ as well. And also the influence of language and morality as well. So what is seen as right and wrong, what is seen as good, better, worse. So just to summarise the key concepts of social psychology now, this is very different to what might be dubbed mainstream psychology, as the other approaches are reducing or more limited in explaining the phenomena we see in the real world down to just an individual. So, for example, looking at what influences one person to behave the way they do. So their genetics, for example, their genes might influence the way that someone behaves, without really taking into account the social context. And so looking at behaviour without thinking about how one behaves within that social context, just looking at that behaviour in isolation. So social psychology really focuses on behaviours that involve the input of others, but also the relationship with those other people as well. So when we think about methodology, social psychologists really favour the idea of sort of observation and experimentation, and really looking at, when observing interactions between people, and also experimentation in which you're not sat in a room on your own. It's looking at how you interact with one another and how you interact maybe with wider society. So hopefully this will just be a nice little reminder of your research methods. I won't go through all, but some of the key methodologies used by social psychologists are direct observations, participant observations where the observer is actually joining in, structured observations where there are behavioural categories and sampling methods used. And then also experiments, field experiments particularly useful here, where we look at behaviour in a natural setting, so rather than the made-up environment within a lab, but also they make use of lab experiments in that sort of more artificial setting, but still again not an individual on their own, looking at them within a social context with others.